never changes because it's the past, so we don't need to study it. So today I'm going to be informing all of you guys about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are actually considered one of history's greatest mysteries. And I'm going to be hopefully informing you about how historiography has changed regarding the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So as a history major who has an emphasis in ancient history, I've taken a lot of classes that we've talked about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so I'm going to start today by giving you a brief overview of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And then I'm going to go into specifics about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And then finally, I'm going to go over kind of the historiography or the changes in historians' perspective regarding the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So to start, I'm going to give a brief overview about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So according to the 7 wonders of the ancient world by Peter Clayton and Martin Price that was published in 1988, the 7 wonders of the ancient world are the pyramids at Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the statue of Zeus at Olympias, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the lighthouse of Alexandria. And actually, only one of these wonders is still standing, and that's the pyramids at Giza. The other 6 were destroyed either by natural forces such as earthquakes or during invasions by mankind. So even though there's only one of these wonders still in existence, it's still important that we study them because these 7 wonders represent some of the greatest historical and engineering and architectural feats in history. And a good example of this is the pyramids of Giza, as they are so old and they are still in existence. And we also need to study them because they help us understand what was important to the people of that time. So a good example of this is the statue of Zeus at Olympias, because it shows some of the religious importances of people of that time. And the 7 wonders of the ancient world were actually picked by Herodotus. And this is important because Herodotus is considered the father of history because he's the first person that ever systematically wrote down what was occurring during his life. And it's important that he's the one that chose these because he had traveled all across the world and he had a good knowledge of the ancient world. So by picking these 7, he knew what was important to the people of that time. So now that I've given you an overview of the 7 wonders as a whole, I'm going to go into the specifics about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So according to Histories.com, the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar II in 600 BC. And rumor has it that he built these gardens because his wife used to live in a mountainous area, and so when she came to live in Babylon, she was really homesick, so he built the gardens for her. But as I'll talk about later in the speech, actually none of this is true because the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were not in Babylon, they actually existed in Nineveh. So the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were a series of tiered gardens that rose up. And according to history, we have to know that they most likely had an extensive irrigation system, which is kind of what makes them part of the great, or what makes their engineering so magnificent, because at that time the irrigation systems weren't very popular, and historians now believe that they must have had a pump or a water wheel, which would have been a really great technological advance for that time. And according to that article, also Alexander the Great said that the gardens were built far above the ground, and that they were built to represent mountain scenery, which might have been what perpetuated the myth that he built them for his wife who was homesick for the mountains. And then Philo of Byzantium also said that the trees in the gardens rose above the ground, and that the roots in the upper terrace were not on the ground, and that streams of water came from above by some sort of mechanical force, which would also suggest that there was some sort of irrigation system. So now that I've given you a brief overview of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were, I'm kind of going to talk about the changes in the historiography regarding the Hanging Gardens. And historiography is just the history of history, so it's basically looking at what historians' perspectives have been over the years. So up until about 20 years ago, there was no definitive proof that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon existed. And according to the biggest wonder about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, they weren't in Babylon, written by David Keyes, published in the Independent UK in 2013, Stephanie Dalley was actually the first person to give any sort of definitive proof that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon existed. She was a historian from Oxford who discovered that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were probably not actually located in Babylon, which might have been why it was so hard for history to prove they existed. But rather, they were found in Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. So she started her research by collecting all sorts of descriptions of the Hanging Gardens so that she could sort of get a picture of what they would have looked like. And while she was doing this, she came across a relief, which is just a carving of gardens that had existed in Nineveh, and the relief closely matched descriptions of the Hanging Gardens. So she began to more fully research into Nineveh, and what she found was that after Assyria conquered Babylon, Nineveh actually became known as the New Babylon, which would have helped perpetuate the myth that the gardens existed in Babylon. And then after this, she looked at the testimony of Alexander the Great, and she found that he had actually camped near Nineveh. So in his testimonies, he might have actually been talking about gardens in Nineveh. And after this, she looked at the topography of Babylon and found that it would have been impossible for gardens to have existed in Babylon. And lastly, she looked into other sources and found that anyone that had said that the gardens had existed in Babylon could have easily been talking about Nineveh. So now that I've kind of explained the changes in historiography, I'm going to wrap up. So today I've talked to you all about the 7 wonders of the ancient world in general, and then I've gone into specifics about the Hanging Gardens, and then I've given sort of a historiography of the gardens themselves. And I hope to leave you guys all with the impression and understanding that history is definitely a static field. As these things happen, especially the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, they existed over 2,500 years ago, and it was not until about 20 years ago that we even knew they existed. And things like this happen all the time, and historical perspectives are constantly changing.